first specimen is an ascites specimen from a 65-year-old male. He has been diagnosed with pancreas adenocarcinoma last year, and he was under treatment but developed massive ascites recently. So this is cytospin preparation. So on low power, we do see hypercellularity, and we do not see aggregates or tight cluster of cells that we usually see in a metastatic adenocarcinoma. However, when we go to higher power, you can appreciate that in the background, there are some like very big cells with relatively like a loose or pale chromatin pattern. The shape of the cell is very bizarre. This looks like an embryo, and the NC ratio is relatively high. So this is pretty eye-catching because these are really big. However, in the background, there are also some bigger cells with more hyperchromasia and with occasional nuclear nucleolus. And then we pay attention to these should be reactive cells. I think in the background there are still some medium-sized cells also looks quite atypical. So in this specimen, it is kind of complicated because you see scattered gigantic cells. The chromatin pattern is relatively pale and loose, and you see other hyperchromatic cell in like a loosely cohesive cluster or single cells. So it looks like there are some atypical cells, likely carcinoma. I think for this one, this is more obvious because it's forming a more tight cluster. But majority of them show like very discohesive individual cell patterns. Some of the cell even looks a little bit like a typical lymphoid cells. But if you pay attention, you can still see some, like a very rare cluster. So it is likely poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma. And the morphology is a little bit unusual. And because this is a pancreatic cancer, so we usually are more familiar with the well-differentiated, like a well-formed tubule glandular pattern. But for this case, this kind of like mixed with very big cell, medium-sized cells, and feature doesn't striking as adenocarcinoma. So it's likely a very poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma. So since we have the cell block preparation, I think it is better for us just to confirm that this is epithelial origin. So our choice of stem would be the MOC 31 or Claudin 4. Because it is from pancreas, there is no specific like a transcriptional factor marker for this scenario. So we would stand it for the MOC 31. Just to check, we know that these bigger cells are more likely to be poorly differentiated carcinoma. However, how about these intermediate size cell? This also looks atypical. So just out of curiosity, we can confirm that this is likely an epithelial origin. But with very poor differentiation, so most of the cells presented as single cells. The next specimen are thyroid needle aspiration. So on low power, this is very cellular. And we see flat monolayer sheets, but also some more like a three-dimensional papillary looking fragments. And in the background, we do not see a lot of colloid. So this is likely a papillary thyroid carcinoma just on this very low power field. So when we suspect papillary thyroid carcinoma, it will usually go to these more flattened sheets where it's easier to find the pseudo inclusion. So here we do see a pseudo inclusion over here. So this is compatible with the papillary thyroid carcinoma. So pay attention to the architectural pattern that I emphasize a lot, that this is a decapitated papilla. Okay, and you find many of these similar structure within the specimen. In the background, occasionally you can see some giant cells, but for this case, it's not very easy to find. So this is a typical papillary thyroid carcinoma. The next case is also a thyroid finding aspiration. So you can tell by the cellularity, it is less cellular than the previous specimen. However, in the background, it still shows no colloid, but you see these tight cluster of the cells scattered throughout the entire specimen. So on this low power feature, you may think about, okay, could it be a follicular neoplasm? Because it seems to be like a scattered, very small and tight cluster, looking like a little bit microfollicular pattern. So on low power, we have this impression that this is likely a tumor and likely a follicular neoplasm. So whenever we have this impression, we need to go to higher power to check if there is any cytologic atypia. So when you go to the higher power, so you can tell that the nuclear feature does not look like a follicular neoplasm because it shows markedly elongation, and if you check with the long axis, it all close with each other. And you also see some grooves somewhere, and here it's sort of forming a decapitated papilla, right? So it looks like a PTC. So for this specimen, it is less cellular, but it still maintains some architecture as well as the nuclear features of PTC. So even though on low power we suspect it is a follicular neoplasm, however, when we go to higher power and we check the cytologic feature, it's compatible with papillary thyroid carcinoma. And we just need to find some pseudo inclusion. I think I find it somewhere, but yeah, here there is one. Okay, you see a pseudo inclusion over here. Okay, so this is also a papillary thyroid carcinoma. So papillary thyroid carcinoma, it depends on the sampling. Sometimes you will get tons of cell on low power. It's already very clear that it is a PTC. Sometimes you only get very scant cells, so it can mimicking a follicular tumor on low power. Sometimes the cells are just too scant. You might not be able to make a definite diagnosis. So you will use like a suspicious or AUS diagnosis like what we talked about last Friday. So this is the direct smear of this case. So for this case, it's more, for this preparation, it's more obvious because on low power, you can already appreciate that it seems to be, there is a, like a fibrovascular meshwork forming these papillary architecture, and lining cell seems quite often falling down from these meshwork. And when you go to higher power, you can appreciate these powdering chromatin pattern, and these like elongation of the nucleus, enlargement. So these looks like a PTC. Okay, so here you do have the papillary architecture on the direct smear. let's see if we can find some pseudo inclusion. Sometimes it's not very easy. Yeah, but overall, the case is diagnostic for papillary thyroid carcinoma. So the final case is pancreatic fine needle aspiration from a 61-year-old male. So this is a very cellular specimen, and here you can see there is a large area of like a three-dimensional glandular, material. The specimen was taken through the gastric, the stomach, and you see some like oranginophilic mucin lining and with this nice honeycombing architecture. So these clusters are all contaminated gastric mucosa, okay? So you see foveolar type of gland and with these large, like a cohesive, nicely arranged honeycombing fragments. So this is a large chunk of a gastric mucosa contamination. So this is not something that we are looking for. And then we go to the background. The background was very, very dirty. It shows quite some like a necrotic debris. So this background is actually not good, okay? And we then go to higher power, and we do see a lot of these atypical cells, some with eccentric nucleus and with prominent nucleolus. These are mostly loosely cohesive in single cells. And I think the nuclear atypia is very prominent. You see, this is a giant cells, like a very atypical tumor giant cell, also here. So this type of feature is already exceeding the usual pattern of adenocarcinoma that we would see in a pancreas biopsy. And with these, a lot of necrosis and these highly atypical cells, some even forming these like spindle-shaped large spindle cells, we would be thinking about, could it be an undifferentiated carcinoma of the pancreas, right? Because you can tell by the morphology, this is way too polymorphic. It's almost what we would call this anaplastic feature, and with a very massive necrotic background. So for this case, we actually suspect that it is an undifferentiated carcinoma. So we will wait for the biopsy. But just based on the morphology, it's diagnostic for malignant, okay? And so we suspect the most poorly differentiated type of cancer in the pancreas, which is undifferentiated carcinoma, just based on the morphology. Okay, so that's all the case for today. Thank you.